One of the most important concepts for this unit is the fact that racism and race socially constructed terms. So the concept of race itself, there is no biological foundation to this concept. Genetic science tells us that the concept of race is in fact a myth, so it is not scientific. What is important is a concept called racialization, and that's where communities construct socially the concepts that we use to describe what race is, and then based on that we treat people differently or unequally. And it can include even perceptions about people's race, such as, in addition to skin color, accents, or the texture of someone's hair, or the way they speak, their name, the clothing that they wear, the food that they eat, or their beliefs that they hold. And remember that race is just one aspect, right, of a patient's identity. There may be many different aspects that all intersect together to create unique experiences. So the Ontario Human Rights Commission has defined racism as a social phenomenon. It's socially constructed. It's about an ideology of inherent superiority. Some people believe that they're better than other people based on racial identity. They can be conscious or unconsciously held beliefs. Racism is embedded systemically within institutions like colleges, universities, government, healthcare systems. And importantly, racism is about power. We also know that racism is a pretty pervasive phenomenon. 40% of racialized people in Ontario who were surveyed by the Ontario Human Rights Commission in a special report that they did in 2017, which is a few years old now, have experienced discrimination because of race or color in the last 5 years. So interesting, right? Almost getting to half of all people who may be considered racialized or who identify as racialized experience discrimination. So it shows how pervasive that actually is. When we look at what is racism, how does it appear, it can be anything. It can be offensive jokes that people tell based on a person's ethnicity. It can be emails that people send to each other. It can be hate crimes committed. But it's deeply rooted prejudicial attitudes, values, and racialized stereotypes that become acted upon and embedded in systems and institutions and in interpersonal interaction over a period of time. And there are economic impacts of racism, right? A study done by the Employment and Social Development Council of Canada, and it looked at a snapshot So, well, to know that racism is done by the Employment and Social Development Council of Canada. And it looked at a snapshot of racialized poverty in Canada. You can see in the image on the right there that racialized people are almost 2 times more likely to be living in poverty, and that people living in poverty, even with certificates or degrees, it is still higher among people who are racialized. So poverty and racism are closely linked together. When we say we want to use an anti-racist approach to combat racism, we're not saying, oh, I'm not racist, right? Anti-racism means that you actually name something that happens as racist, you acknowledge it, you name it for what it is, and then you challenge it. And you challenge the way that people are treated based on racialized identity. And it's about always acting to end that mistreatment, oppression, and violence that follows as a result of racism. We do have a history of racism in Canada. While we are a welcoming nation, we do have really poignant parts of our history that have illustrated that racism does exist in Canada. Everything from slavery to residential schools to head tax to different instances where people have arrived from abroad, and even the internment of different groups. So one of the big things that you're going to read about in Chapter 6 around Indigenous people is the trauma of something known as residential schools. So residential schools were set up by the Canadian government, and they forcibly made all Indigenous children, young children, some from the age of 4 to the age of 16 or 18, they were forced to live in these residential schools, and the condition in these residential schools were really horrible. It's actually referred to as Canada's genocide. And they were forced to assimilate. Their heads were shaven when they arrived. They weren't allowed to speak their Indigenous languages or eat their food or wear their clothing. But worse than that, they were subject to all forms of abuse: verbal abuse, physical abuse, and sexual abuse. There was also a lot of medical experiments done related to nutrition, deprivation of food, vaccines on the children without informed consent. And because of the abuse suffered by Indigenous people within residential schools, I remember the last one just closed in 1996, so it's not that far in the past. You may, as a nurse working in hospital settings, encounter Indigenous people who have been residents of residential schools and who have experienced that trauma. And if not firsthand, maybe second or third generation, as that trauma has carried throughout different generations. There's also a phenomenon known as the 60 scoops, where Indigenous children were apprehended by government officials and placed in non-Indigenous families. And there's also a high percentage of murdered and missing Indigenous women that the Indigenous community feels is not being investigated adequately by police. You may, as you travel around Niagara region or other parts of Ontario or Canada, see these kinds of tributes where you'll see a whole bunch of shoes on a step of a public building. These are living monuments that were built to honor the lives of children lost in residential schools. And recently in Canada, they've began to discover the graves, mass graves, and mass burial sites of children around these residential schools who, when they died as a result of whatever, could have been malnutrition, could have been untreated TB, could have been sexual abuse, and it could have been homicide, that these children were just simply dropped in these mass graves and buried and never reported to their families that they had actually passed. So more recently, they've been discovering the bodies of these children as they're excavating the sites around residential schools. And so these shoes are meant to represent the lives of the children who were killed and died in these schools. You may also, on May 5th, see red dresses hanging in trees all around Canada, and that is a way of remembering the National Day of Awareness for missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. One of the really important issues in terms of equity, diversity, inclusion, and decolonization that you need to be aware of as you're entering the healthcare profession is Indigenous healthcare and Indigenous healthcare beliefs and what the experience of Indigenous people in Canada has been historically. And so you'll find in your folder on Blackboard under week 8 in racialization 3 videos for you to watch. They're short videos. The first one is on Indigenous health in Canada, which is only 6 minutes. The next one is a TED Talk, which is very good, and it's about Indigenous knowledge used to close the gaps in Indigenous health in Canada. A little bit longer, but an excellent video as well, and there are test questions based on these videos. The last video link there you can watch, that's optional, there won't be a question on that one, but it is the narrative, it's the first person stories from people who survived the residential schools, and they talk about what their experience was like within those schools. We also know that there's a history of racism against African people, that people often talk about slavery only being in the United States, but slavery did exist in Canada, and today we still see that African Canadians and Black Canadians are experiencing overt discrimination still in the workplace, in their housing, in schools, transportation, and in healthcare. So also included in that lecture folder for this unit is a really good video by a doctor in the United States who talks about racism and how to combat racism and what she calls placism, being like where you were born in medicine. And there will be a test question associated with that. We also know that Chinese people in Canada have a history of being discriminated against. Canada recruited a lot of people from China to come here and work to build the Canadian Pacific Railway, but once it was completed, Canada wanted to discourage these Chinese laborers from staying, so they imposed a head tax, which today would be about the equivalent of $100,000 that you had to pay in order to be able to stay in Canada. We also know that anti-Asian racism exists in Canada. It has historical roots, but particularly since COVID-19, we're seeing instances of assault, we're seeing instances of verbal harassment, and we're seeing that East Asians are the most highly impacted, but many people are impacted even who aren't Asian. People are being spit at, coughed at. There's been physical violence against people and being blamed for COVID-19. And so I've also posted in your lecture folder a very short video with people talking about what anti-Asian Asian racism actually looks like in Canada. And we know that there's a history of a root of that. In 1914, there was a ship called the Komagatu Maru that landed in Vancouver, and aboard were 376 Sikh, Hindu, and Muslim passengers, many who were British subjects, and they were not allowed to stay in Canada. They were forcibly returned um, to India, where even though many were British subjects and could have stayed. The same thing happened to Jewish people during World War II, when Nazi Germany was exterminating um, Jewish people in gas chambers. A boatload of Jewish people, there was actually 900 Jewish refugees, uh, came to Canada on an ocean liner called the MS St. Louis, and it was forced back to Europe, and almost 40% of the passengers aboard there later died in the Holocaust. So you can see there are examples in Canadian history of racism, right, that have cost people their lives and have impacted them in different ways. Also during World War II, the Canadian government, after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, forced 200,000 Japanese people, 75% who were Canadian citizens, into prison camps. And they took away their homes, their fishing boats, and their businesses. And when the war ended, 4,000 were deported to Japan. This was also true for Italian Canadian people as well. And generally, there were times prior to 1967 where immigrants were discriminated. Canada favored immigrants who came from the United Kingdom or from Europe, and they discriminated against people who came from Asia, Africa. Um, it wasn't until 1967 when Canada introduced an immigration policy that was based on a point system, based on a person's individual contributions they could bring to the country, that discrimination based on where you came from stopped. Also, in your textbook, it talks about 4 different kinds of racism. You have quite a few questions on your test related to that, to these 4 different forms of racism. Representational racism, it's when you use an image and it depicts a stereotype, right? So we have a team here in the United States called the Cleveland Indians, and they use an indigenous person in a stereotypical image, and it's making the joke, can you imagine the Cleveland Asians or the Cleveland Africans or the Cleveland Hispanics, right? Using those kinds of racial stereotypes. Ideological racism is a form of racism that's rooted in people's ideas, beliefs, and their worldviews that reinforce and advance notions of racial superiority or inferiority. And we saw that in the former U.S. President Donald Trump when he made the statement, when Mexico sends its people, they're not sending their best. They're bringing drugs, they're bringing crime, they're rapists. And some, I assume, are good people. So you can see how he's generalizing Mexican people in a very derogatory and racist manner. Discursive racism is a form of racism expressed through written or oral communication. So it can be hate speech, like it can be things on the internet or on Twitter, or on Facebook or social media, any form of social media. They can be racial slurs that are spoken to another person. We see here the example of an Olympian from the last Olympics from Greece making this very racist comment. And so that would be a form of discursive racism because it's written and spoken communication. Discursive racism, we also saw a surge as another example, an anti-Asian racism that accompanied the pandemic. We see another example in Donald Trump, the former president of the United States, where he's blaming the pandemic as China's fault. And in fact, in his first presidential debate, he referred to the virus as the China plague. And you can see from the image on the left here that after he starts using this discursive racism in tweets, that the uh, anti-Asian racism rate in the United States rose by 85%. Interactional racism is a form of racism expressed when people socially interact with each other, and how those with privilege interact with those who are oppressed. So you can see in these pictures here with the people who are wearing white hoods, they're members of neo-Nazi white supremacist organizations who perpetrate interactional racism against racialized people. Another form of interactional racism. So racism occurs at three different levels. It can occur at the individual level, or what we call the interpersonal level. Everyday kinds of racisms that happen when, by the way people speak, or glances, or interpersonal actions. And then racism can also operate at a larger level, like within institutions at a systemic level, things like government or education or healthcare or justice. And then the third level is societal, which involves all society's institutions as well as a society's dominant culture or ideology. And we saw that in South Africa under the apartheid system. This is an app that you can download on your cell phone. It's called Everyday Racism, and then it's an exposure to that individual interaction that's described as racism. It's a little game to play. When we look at racism at an institutional or systemic level, let's say, for example, you're applying for a job at a hospital, and because of the name that you use and because your experience is from a country outside of Canada, you could experience racism as a result of that. And it may be somewhat hidden from you. So, a recent study that was done on something called whitened resumes, they looked at applicants who were African American and who were Asian. And when they submitted their non-whitened resumes, and you can see by the green bars there, they weren't called for interviews at a very high rate compared to when they whitened their resume. So instead of calling themselves by their actual name, they used Joe Smith, or they used a more anglicized name, and then they didn't put the country where credentials were acquired. That's what's called a whitening of resumes. They were more likely to get jobs. So that's really widespread and pervasive and happens at a systemic level. You learned in Chapter 2 what a stereotype was. You learned what prejudice was, and you learned what discrimination was. So stereotype being something that is a label or a category, prejudice being an attitude, and discrimination being an action. Stereotypes exist as cognition. Prejudice is happening at the affect or feeling level. And then for something to be discriminatory, there has to be a behavior or an action. So there's lots of racial stereotypes out there based on ethnic origin, based on the color of somebody's skin, based on their creed. And stereotypes are basically assuming all racialized people of a particular group all have the same characteristics and abilities. And you can see these racial stereotypes in Chapter 6 in the picture that's used in Halloween costumes. So Halloween happens October 31st as a celebration. People get dressed up, they go to parties, kids collect candy at doors. and the costumes that people use, as depicted here, show really stereotypical kinds of imagery. So for racial discrimination to happen, it's a legally prohibited act. There has to be conduct or action or behavior. It doesn't matter whether it's intentional or not, but there has to be some action based on a person's race. And some of the race-related grounds that constitute racial discrimination: color of someone's skin, their ethnic origin, their ancestry, their place of origin, their citizenship, or their creed. Let's take the example of Sasheen, who's a nurse from Jamaica, as an example of workplace discrimination. She obtains an RN in Canada, and she goes to work in a hospital. Sasheen is a black woman. During this time, she's denied mentoring and training opportunities that were available to other people. And when she asks administration why, she's told because she can't get along with her co-worker, Barbara. But she's reported to administration that Barbara regularly mocks her accent and nationality. And when she's asked Barbara to stop, Barbara tells her, "Oh, just lighten up, it's a joke." And administration has not acted upon that. So that workplace actually is guilty of racial discrimination. Another key concept for you to know is racial profiling. It's any action undertaken for reasons of safety, security, or public protection that relies on stereotypes to treat people differently. We see it a lot in policing, but it's not just among criminal justice situations. Here are some other examples of racial profiling. So a landlord asks a student who is of Chinese ancestry to move out because they believe they will expose them to COVID-19. Or a police officer assumes someone's more likely to have committed a crime because they are black. Right? Or a bar refuses to serve Indigenous patrons because they assume that they will get drunk and rowdy. So these are all stereotypes that are acted upon and are used under the guise of safety and protection, but they are in fact examples of racial profiling, which is not allowed. Colorblindness is also a form of racism, and this happens quite often. So people believe that if you say things like, "When I see you, I don't see the color of your skin," or when people say things, or I've often seen posters, "We are all the same race, the human race." Well, that's true. The problem is that this kind of color blindness means also being blind to the consequences of racialized experience. So you can't deny when someone experiences racism, you have to acknowledge it, right? By being colorblind isn't dealing with the issue of race. I remember attending a training one time, and the facilitator walked around with a white egg and a brown egg, and she asked us to crack them into pans. And then when we did, she said, "See, look, underneath the skin of the egg, everybody's the same. They're a yolk." But, well, that's true. We all belong to the human race. We all have different experiences as a result of different aspects of our identity. And we can't ignore them, or we ignore the pain, the discrimination, and the oppression that people can experience because of those aspects of their identity. The concept of shadeism is a concept that privileges lighter skin over darker skin. It's something referred to as pigmentocracy. So the more pigmentation you have, the more likely you are to be discriminated against. We can see concepts of beauty often more identified with the image on the right than the image on the left. That's a form of racism that's specifically known as shadeism. Another form of racism is something called tokenism. So that's where you include one or a small number of members of a minority group to make it look like you're being inclusive. So as you see in the picture here, all of the people depicted there are white, but they've added one black person in the middle. That's a form of tokenism. Hate crimes are crimes committed against people or property that are motivated by hate or prejudice against a victim's racial, ethnic, um, religious, or sexual identity. So let's now look at the framework that we talk about anti-racism in. So there are different approaches in healthcare. We've talked about many of these. We've talked about health equity. We've talked about anti-bias and intersectionality, what it means to be anti-oppressive. And we've talked a little bit about in chapter 1, cultural safety. So cultural safety began as an indigenous concept, and it was about the ability to meet a patient within their own individual cultural worldview through a process of self-reflection, leading to an awareness that cultural bias exists and that there's power and privilege that exists within the patient and provider relationship. So let's briefly, just for a few minutes, take a look at what it means to have an anti-racist approach. It's built on the concepts of cultural safety. So sometimes we talk about cultural awareness, cultural sensitivity, cultural competency, but today in Canada, we refer to this concept as cultural safety, and it means respectfully engaging and addressing the power imbalances that exist in your patient nurse relationship. It's about trying to create an environment that's free from discrimination, where people feel safe, and it's based on cultural humility. Not we unless you're an anthropologist who's studied for 50 years, your knowledge of everyone's culture at a deep level is limited. So having cultural humility is acknowledging that we're all learners when it comes to understanding your patient or your